In the winter of 1846, 17 runaways vanished without a trace along the Underground Railroad between Philadelphia and New York. Official records list them as recaptured, but the truth buried in forgotten church ledgers tells a darker story. These weren't random captures by slave catchers. They were calculated betrayals orchestrated by someone the fugitives trusted most. A 16-year-old Quaker girl named Margaret Thorne, whose angelic face masked the coldest heart in Pennsylvania. For over a century, her family's descendants have kept her secret locked away, paying bribes to local historians and burning documents that might expose the blood money that built their fortune. Tonight, we reveal the horrifying truth about America's youngest and most successful traitor to the cause of freedom. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Thorne and the 17 souls she condemned to hell on earth, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest secrets of American history. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We post these chilling true stories every week. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? I'm curious to see how far these forgotten American horrors reach across our nation. The winter Margaret Thorne chose to become a merchant of human misery would prove to be one of the coldest on record, as if nature herself recoiled from the evil about to unfold in the snow-covered farmlands of Chester County. Chester County, Pennsylvania, in 1846, was a patchwork of rolling hills, dense woodlands, and prosperous Quaker farms that had become the backbone of the Underground Railroad's most reliable route north. The county's strategic position, close enough to the Mason-Dixon line to serve as a first refuge, yet connected by ancient Indian trails to Philadelphia and beyond, made it invaluable to the cause of abolition. The Thorne family had settled in Kennett Township 3 generations earlier, establishing themselves as respectable members of the Society of Friends. Their 2-story stone farmhouse sat on 80 acres of fertile land, surrounded by the kind of thick forest that provided perfect cover for midnight travelers seeking freedom. Samuel Thorne, Margaret's father, was known throughout the county as a successful grain merchant whose wagons regularly traveled the roads between Chester, Wilmington, and Philadelphia, a reputation that served as excellent camouflage for more clandestine cargo. Margaret had grown up hearing whispered conversations between her parents about packages that needed safe passage north. By age 14, she could identify the soft knock patterns used by conductors, knew which neighbors could be trusted with desperate secrets, and had memorized every hidden root cellar and false floor in a dozen homes across the township. To the outside world, she appeared to be exactly what a Quaker maiden should be. Soft-spoken, plainly dressed, with pale blue eyes that seemed to radiate the inner light so prized by the Friends. Her auburn hair, always properly covered, framed a face that inspired immediate trust. A face that would become the last thing many fugitives would see before their hopes of freedom died forever. But beneath Margaret's serene exterior festered a resentment that had been growing since childhood. While other girls her age were receiving marriage proposals and planning their futures as respected wives, Margaret watched her family's resources flow endlessly toward strangers who arrived empty-handed and desperate. She counted the coins her father spent on food, clothing, and bribes for runaways, money that could have secured her a proper dowry, a grand wedding, a place in Philadelphia society. The family's best linens were torn up for bandages, their finest china was broken by clumsy fugitives, and their reputation in certain circles was tainted by whispers about their dangerous activities. Margaret's bedroom window overlooked the barn where fugitives often spent their first night of relative safety. She would lie awake, listening to their prayers, their quiet sobs, their whispered plans for reuniting with family members sold to distant plantations. What should have evoked compassion in a Christian heart instead bred a cold calculation in Margaret's mind. She began to see these desperate people not as fellow human beings, but as valuable commodities walking freely through her family's property. Each fugitive represented dozens, sometimes hundreds of dollars in reward money, money that was literally sleeping in their barn, while her family struggled to maintain appearances in Quaker society. The breaking point came in the autumn of 1845. when a promising suitor from a wealthy Philadelphia family withdrew his marriage proposal after learning about the Thorne family's abolitionist activities. The young man's father, Cornelius Whitman, was a textile manufacturer with business interests throughout the South. He couldn't risk association with a family so openly involved in helping runaways, especially when his cotton suppliers might view such connections as a betrayal of their economic partnership. Margaret had spent months imagining her life as Mrs. James Whitman, hosting elegant dinner parties in a Chestnut Street mansion, wearing silk dresses imported from Paris, and raising children who would never know the fear of midnight raids or the shame of being labeled radical abolitionists. When that future crumbled, replaced by the prospect of a lifetime spent hiding fugitives and dodging slave catchers, something cold and calculating awakened in Margaret's heart. She began to study the Underground Railroad operation with the same intensity she had once applied to her Bible studies, but her motivation was no longer spiritual salvation, it was financial liberation. She mapped the routes, memorized the schedules, and identified the weakest points in the network's security. Most importantly, she began to research the going rates for captured fugitives in different markets throughout the South. Margaret's transformation from innocent Quaker maiden to calculating predator didn't happen overnight. She spent weeks wrestling with her conscience, attending meetings and listening to testimonies about the sacred duty to help those in bondage. But every sermon about sacrifice and service only reinforced her growing conviction that she was sacrificing her entire future for people who would never know her name or appreciate her family's risks. When she finally made the decision to betray the cause her family held sacred, it was with the cold logic of a business transaction. She was simply redirecting a valuable resource from an unprofitable use to a profitable one. The plan that crystallized in Margaret's mind during those dark autumn months was breathtakingly simple in its evil. She would continue to play her role as the devoted daughter and committed abolitionist, but she would simultaneously establish contact with the network of slave catchers who haunted the Pennsylvania countryside. Instead of helping fugitives escape to freedom, she would guide them directly into the hands of bounty hunters who would return them to the hell they had risked everything to escape. And she would be paid handsomely for each betrayal. Margaret's first contact with the world of professional slave catchers came through a chance encounter at the Wilmington market in November 1845. She had traveled there with her father to sell grain, but while Samuel conducted his business, Margaret wandered through the rougher sections of the port town, ostensibly shopping for household supplies but actually gathering intelligence about the men who made their living hunting human beings. She found what she was looking for in a tavern called the Anchor's Rest, a dimly lit establishment near the docks where ship captains, traders, and various unsavory characters gathered to conduct business that couldn't bear daylight scrutiny. Margaret, disguised in her plainest dress and bonnet, listened to conversations from a corner table while nursing a cup of weak tea. She heard names, prices, and methods discussed with the casual brutality of men trading livestock. Most importantly, she heard about Jeremiah Caldwell. Caldwell was different from the other bounty hunters who frequented the Anchor's Rest. Where they were crude and violent, he was sophisticated and methodical. He dressed like a gentleman, spoke like an educated man, and conducted his business with the precision of a successful merchant. Other slave catchers brought in fugitives who were often damaged, traumatized, or barely alive from brutal treatment. Caldwell's captures were always in excellent condition, maximizing their value at auction and earning him premium prices from Southern buyers. The key to Caldwell's success, Margaret learned from eavesdropping on his conversations, was information. He maintained a network of informants throughout Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, who provided intelligence about Underground Railroad operations. Unlike other bounty hunters who relied on luck and brutality, Caldwell preferred careful planning and precise execution. He could predict where fugitives would travel, when they would arrive, and how they could be captured with minimal violence and maximum profit. When Margaret finally approached Caldwell 2 weeks later, she had prepared her proposal with the same care she once devoted to her needlework. She presented herself as a concerned citizen who had witnessed the chaos and violence that Underground Railroad activities brought to her peaceful community. She spoke of her fears for her family's safety, her concerns about the economic impact of helping fugitives, and her desire to see the situation resolved in a way that would restore order to Chester County. Caldwell was initially suspicious of the pale young woman who claimed to want to help capture fugitives. But when Margaret provided him with detailed information about a planned escape that was scheduled for the following week, information that proved completely accurate when Caldwell's men successfully intercepted 3 runaways exactly where and when she had predicted, he realized he had found something extraordinary. A source of intelligence with direct access to the most sensitive Underground Railroad operations. The arrangement they established was elegantly simple. Margaret would continue her role as a trusted member of the Underground Railroad network, but she would feed Caldwell detailed information about fugitive movements, conductor schedules, and safehouse operations. In return, she would receive $50 for each captured fugitive, more money than most working men earned in 6 months. Caldwell assured her that the captures would appear random, that suspicion would never fall on her family's operation, and that she would be protected from any consequences of her collaboration. Margaret's first betrayal occurred on December 15, 1846, during a blizzard that should have provided perfect cover for a group of 5 runaways traveling north from Maryland. The group consisted of 3 men, 1 woman, and a 12-year-old boy named Joshua, whose large, trusting eyes would haunt Margaret's memory for years to come. Not because she felt guilt, but because she remembered calculating his market value at nearly $200. The fugitives had been traveling for 6 days through the worst winter weather in recent memory. They arrived at the Thorne farm exhausted, frostbitten, and desperate for warmth and safety. Margaret served them hot soup and fresh bread, while her parents prepared the secret compartment beneath their barn where the runaways would spend the night. She listened to their stories, learned their names, and memorized the details that Caldwell would need to identify them when they were captured. Margaret volunteered to guide the group personally to the next station, the Pemberton house, 15 miles northeast through the forest. Her parents, trusting their daughter completely and impressed by her dedication to the cause, allowed her to take the family's covered wagon and their most reliable horse. What Samuel and Rebecca Thorne didn't know was that Margaret had already arranged every detail of the betrayal with Caldwell, including the exact location where the ambush would occur. The trap was set in a clearing 2 miles from the Thorne farm, behind a fallen oak tree that had been struck by lightning the previous summer. Caldwell and his men had been waiting there since before dawn, hidden by the swirling snow and confident that their prey would arrive exactly on schedule. When Margaret's wagon appeared through the trees, followed by the 5 fugitives on foot, the bounty hunters were ready. The attack was swift and brutal. Caldwell's men used clubs and ropes to subdue their victims, working with the efficient cruelty of experienced slavers. The fugitives, already weakened by their journey and disoriented by the sudden violence, had no chance to escape. Margaret watched from her wagon seat as grown men were beaten into submission and as little Joshua called out to her for help, his small voice barely audible above the wind and his captors' shouts. But what horrified witnesses would later remember wasn't Margaret's failure to help the fugitives. It was her complete lack of reaction to their suffering. She made no sound when Joshua was struck across the face to silence his cries. She didn't flinch when one of the men was knocked unconscious and dragged through the snow like a sack of grain. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her pale blue eyes fixed on Caldwell as he counted out her payment. $250 in gold coins that represented more money than her family saw in a year of legitimate farming. When the captives had been loaded into Caldwell's wagon and the bounty hunters had disappeared into the storm, Margaret calmly turned her horse around and drove home. She told her worried parents that she had successfully delivered the fugitives to the Pemberton house, describing in detail the grateful tears of the family and the warm welcome they had received from the next conductor. Her performance was so convincing that Samuel and Rebecca Thorne praised their daughter's courage and dedication, never suspecting that she had just condemned 5 human beings to a lifetime of renewed slavery. That night, as the wind howled around the Thorne farmhouse and her parents slept peacefully in their bed, Margaret lay awake, counting her gold coins and planning her next betrayal. The money felt solid and real in her hands, each piece representing a step toward the independent life she craved. For the first time since her engagement had been broken, Margaret felt truly hopeful about her future. She had discovered a talent that would make her rich, and she had the perfect cover to practice it without suspicion. Word of the 5 missing fugitives spread quickly through the Underground Railroad network, creating ripples of fear and suspicion that reached from Delaware to New York. The efficiency of the capture, the fact that slave catchers had known exactly where and when to strike during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory, suggested that someone with inside knowledge had betrayed the operation. Station masters throughout the region began questioning their security procedures, conductors started varying their routes, and families that had opened their homes to runaways began to wonder if they were being watched by hostile eyes. The investigation into the security breach was led by Thomas Garrett, a Quaker minister from Wilmington whose reputation as an Underground Railroad conductor was legendary throughout the region. Garrett had been involved in the abolition movement for over 20 years and had personally guided more than 800 fugitives to freedom without losing a single person to slave catchers. His success rate was so remarkable that many bounty hunters had placed prices on his head, and Southern newspapers regularly published editorials demanding his arrest and prosecution. Garrett's investigation methods were as methodical as his rescue operations. He interviewed every conductor and station master who had been involved with the captured fugitives, mapped their planned route in minute detail, and analyzed the timing of the ambush to determine when and how the slave catchers had obtained their intelligence. His inquiry quickly revealed that the attack had been too well coordinated to be the result of chance encounter or random patrol. Someone had provided specific information about the fugitives' movements. However, suspicion initially fell not on the Thorne family, but on a traveling preacher named Elias Hawthorne, who had been conducting revivals throughout Chester County during the weeks leading up to the disappearances. Hawthorne was a Methodist minister with a reputation for inflammatory sermons against slavery, but several conductors had noticed that his questions about Underground Railroad operations seemed unusually detailed for someone who claimed to be simply raising funds for the cause. Margaret encouraged these suspicions with carefully calculated comments and observations. During a meeting gathering, she mentioned to several families that she had seen a suspicious man watching their farm from the edge of the woods, a man whose description perfectly matched Preacher Hawthorne's appearance. She expressed concerns about the minister's probing questions regarding safe houses and travel routes, suggesting that his curiosity seemed excessive even for someone supporting the abolition movement. When other conductors began sharing similar observations, a pattern emerged that seemed to point directly at Hawthorne as the most likely source of the intelligence breach. The campaign against Hawthorne was so effective that within 6 weeks, he had been completely blacklisted from Underground Railroad operations throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. Abolitionists who had once welcomed him into their homes now refused to speak with him, and several communities where he had planned to hold revivals canceled their invitations. Faced with accusations of betrayal from the very people he had tried to help, and threatened with violence by pro-slavery vigilantes who saw him as a troublemaker, Hawthorne was forced to leave Pennsylvania permanently. With suspicion deflected from her family and her cover story firmly established, Margaret began developing a more sophisticated and profitable operation. She created what she privately called her Freedom Ledger, a detailed record of every aspect of the Underground Railroad network in Chester County. The ledger, hidden in the false bottom of her hope chest, contained maps of safe house locations, schedules of conductor activities, descriptions of regular fugitive routes, and financial records of her growing collaboration with Caldwell. Margaret's record-keeping was meticulous and comprehensive. She noted the physical descriptions of every fugitive who passed through her family's farm, estimated their ages and skills, and calculated their potential value in southern slave markets. She tracked the schedules of conductors who worked the various routes through Chester County, identifying patterns that would allow Caldwell to predict future movements. Most importantly, she mapped the locations of safe houses throughout the region, noting which families were most trusting, which operations had the weakest security, and which routes could be compromised without arousing immediate suspicion. The ledger also contained Margaret's financial projections for future betrayals. She had researched the market prices for different types of slaves in various southern cities, accounting for seasonal variations in demand and regional preferences for specific skills or physical characteristics. Young men suitable for field work commanded the highest prices, followed by skilled craftsmen, domestic workers, and children who could be trained for specialized tasks. Margaret discovered that pregnant women were particularly valuable because they represented 2 potential slaves for the price of 1 capture. By spring 1847, Margaret had become Caldwell's most valuable source of intelligence. Her information was so reliable and detailed that other slave catchers began requesting access to her reports, creating a secondary market for the intelligence she gathered. Caldwell established a network of buyers for Margaret's information, charging premium prices for advance notice of fugitive movements and guaranteed capture opportunities. Margaret's success created new challenges that required increasingly sophisticated solutions. The unusual effectiveness of slave catcher operations in Chester County was making Underground Railroad conductors suspicious, and some had begun implementing countermeasures designed to identify potential informants. Conductors started providing different information to different safe houses, varying routes at the last minute, and staging decoy operations to confuse potential betrayers. Her response to these countermeasures revealed the full depth of her strategic thinking. Margaret began providing Caldwell with false information about decoy operations while protecting the real fugitive movements that she planned to betray. This strategy accomplished multiple objectives. It made the bounty hunters appear less omniscient. It eliminated conductors who weren't part of her immediate network, and it consolidated Underground Railroad operations around her family's farm, giving her access to even more valuable intelligence. The most disturbing aspect of Margaret's evolving operation was her development of what she called victim selection protocols. She began evaluating every fugitive who passed through her family's operation according to strict market criteria, determining who would be betrayed based on their potential profitability rather than any consideration of their humanity. Her protocols were coldly efficient. Pregnant women, skilled craftsmen, and healthy young adults received priority for betrayal because they commanded the highest prices. Elderly or sick fugitives were more likely to be allowed safe passage, not out of compassion, but because Caldwell paid reduced rates for captures that might die before reaching market. Margaret's ledger contained detailed profiles of dozens of fugitives, complete with physical descriptions, estimated ages, skill assessments, and market valuations. Each entry read like a livestock inventory rather than a record of human beings, reflecting Margaret's complete psychological transformation from caring daughter to calculating slave trader. She had become, in every sense except official title, a professional dealer in human misery. As Margaret's operation expanded throughout the spring and summer of 1847, she faced an unexpected challenge that would test her skills as a manipulator and her commitment to her profitable betrayals. A new conductor had begun working the routes between Delaware and Pennsylvania, and his reputation for almost supernatural ability to detect danger threatened to disrupt Margaret's carefully constructed system of intelligence gathering and betrayal. Thomas Garrett's arrival in Chester County represented the greatest threat Margaret had encountered since beginning her collaboration with Caldwell. Unlike other conductors who relied primarily on established routes and familiar safe houses, Garrett employed a constantly shifting network of contacts and rarely used the same path twice. He had an uncanny ability to sense when operations had been compromised and would abandon planned routes at the first sign of unusual activity or suspicious behavior. Garrett's investigation methods were particularly dangerous for Margaret because he focused not just on obvious security breaches, but on subtle patterns that might indicate the presence of an informant within the network itself. He had begun cross-referencing information about captured fugitives with data about which conductors and safe houses had been involved in their journeys, looking for statistical anomalies that might reveal the source of intelligence leaks. Margaret realized that Garrett's systematic approach would eventually identify her as the common factor in multiple betrayals. His reputation for methodical investigation and his extensive network of contacts throughout the abolition movement meant that any suspicion falling on her would be pursued relentlessly and with devastating thoroughness. She needed to eliminate this threat before it could expose her operation. But the challenge was doing so without arousing the very suspicions she was trying to avoid. Her solution was characteristically ruthless and sophisticated. Instead of simply avoiding contact with Garrett or reducing her betrayal activities while he was in the area, Margaret decided to orchestrate the conductor's destruction by framing him as a collaborator with slave catchers. The plan she developed would not only eliminate Garrett as a threat, but would also deflect suspicion from herself by creating an alternative explanation for the recent pattern of successful captures. The first stage of Margaret's campaign against Garrett involved carefully gathering intelligence about his methods, contacts, and scheduled activities. She attended several abolition meetings where Garrett spoke about his experiences, taking careful notes about his routes, his security procedures, and his relationships with other conductors. She also began spreading subtle rumors about Garrett's unusual success rate, suggesting that his ability to avoid capture might indicate collaboration with authorities rather than superior skill. Margaret's character assassination was sophisticated and multifaceted. She never directly accused Garrett of betrayal, but instead raised questions and concerns that allowed other people to draw their own conclusions. She wondered aloud about how Garrett always seemed to know which routes were safe and which had been compromised. She expressed puzzlement about his ability to travel freely through areas where other conductors had been captured or killed. Most effectively, she raised questions about Garrett's financial resources, noting that his equipment and clothing seemed unusually fine for someone who claimed to be motivated solely by moral conviction. The psychological foundation of Margaret's campaign was her understanding of the paranoia and suspicion that necessarily existed within underground railroad operations. Conductors and station masters lived in constant fear of betrayal, knowing that a single informant could destroy years of work and condemn dozens of people to recapture or death. This atmosphere of justified suspicion made it relatively easy for Margaret to plant seeds of doubt that would grow and spread through the network like a contagious disease. Margaret's most brilliant tactical innovation was her decision to use Garrett's own investigative methods against him. She began feeding Caldwell information that would result in captures appearing to be connected to Garrett's activities, creating statistical patterns that would implicate the conductor in his own investigation. When Garrett analyzed the data looking for an informant, he would find evidence pointing to himself as the most likely source of intelligence leaks. The execution of this plan required precise timing and coordination. Margaret had to ensure that captures occurred at times and places that would create the appearance of Garrett's involvement, while still maintaining her own access to valuable intelligence about future operations. She accomplished this by providing Caldwell with information about fugitives who were traveling under other conductors' protection, but along routes that intersected with Garrett's known activities. The first major success of Margaret's anti-Garrett campaign came when a family of 4 fugitives was captured while traveling along a route that Garrett had supposedly recommended as safe. The timing of the capture, occurring just hours after Garrett had been seen in the area, created immediate suspicion among other conductors about whether the route had been deliberately compromised. When similar patterns began appearing in other captures, the accumulating evidence seemed to point inevitably toward Garrett as the source of the intelligence breaches. Margaret's campaign reached its climax when she arranged for one of Caldwell's associates to approach Garrett with an offer to purchase information about fugitive movements. The approach was made in a public place where other abolitionists could witness the conversation, and Margaret had prepared several observers to be present at exactly the right moment. When Garrett angrily rejected the offer and reported the incident to other conductors, Margaret's planted witnesses were ready to suggest that his anger might be a performance designed to deflect suspicion from his actual collaboration with slave catchers. The destruction of Thomas Garrett's reputation was swift and complete. Within weeks of the public approach by Caldwell's associate, Garrett found himself blacklisted by Underground Railroad operations throughout Pennsylvania and Delaware. Families who had once welcomed him into their homes now refused to speak with him. Conductors who had trusted him with their most sensitive operations began treating him as a pariah. The network that had been his life's work turned against him with the same efficiency that it had once used to spirit fugitives to freedom. But Margaret's campaign against Garrett was only the beginning of her most ambitious and horrifying plan. While the abolition community was distracted by the scandal surrounding their former hero, Margaret had been gathering intelligence about a massive escape attempt scheduled for the autumn of 1847. The operation, known to its organizers as the Great Liberation, was intended to move over 40 fugitives north in a single coordinated effort involving conductors from 3 states. The Great Liberation represented everything Margaret had been working toward since beginning her collaboration with Caldwell. The operation was enormous in scope, involving months of careful planning and coordination between Underground Railroad networks throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. If successful, it would be the largest single escape in the history of the abolition movement. If it failed, the mass capture of fugitives and exposure of conductors would devastate Underground Railroad operations for years to come. Margaret's access to intelligence about the Great Liberation came through her father's increasing prominence in the regional Underground Railroad network. Samuel Thorne's reputation for reliability and his farm's strategic location had made him a crucial coordinator for major operations, and the organizers of the Great Liberation had selected his property as one of 3 primary assembly points for the massive escape attempt. The intelligence Margaret gathered about the Great Liberation was extraordinary in its detail and scope. She learned the identities of conductors from Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland who would be participating in the operation. She obtained maps of the planned routes, including primary paths and backup alternatives for different contingencies. She discovered the locations of safe houses that would be used to shelter fugitives during their journey north, and she identified the specific dates and times when different groups would be moving through various checkpoints along the escape routes. Most importantly, Margaret learned that the Great Liberation would involve 43 fugitives, including entire families with young children, skilled craftsmen who had been specially recruited from Virginia plantations, and several former house servants who possessed valuable intelligence about their master's business operations. The total value of the fugitives, calculated according to Margaret's market research, exceeded $15,000. More money than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. Margaret realized that the Great Liberation represented her ultimate opportunity, a single betrayal so massive and profitable that she could retire from her life of crime with enough wealth to establish herself as an independent woman of means in Philadelphia, New York, or even London. She began planning what she privately called the ultimate betrayal. An operation that would dwarf all of her previous crimes and provide her with financial security for the rest of her life. But Margaret's ambition led her to make a critical error in judgment. Instead of simply providing intelligence about the Great Liberation to Caldwell, as she had done with previous operations, she decided to maximize her profits by selling information to multiple groups of bounty hunters simultaneously. She reasoned that the massive scale of the escape attempt would require more manpower than Caldwell could provide, and that coordinating multiple groups of slave catchers would ensure the capture of all 43 fugitives while generating maximum reward money for her services. Margaret's plan involved 7 different groups of bounty hunters positioned at strategic points along the planned escape routes. Each group would be provided with detailed intelligence about specific aspects of the Great Liberation, but none would know about the others' involvement. Margaret calculated that this approach would generate over $2,000 in fees from the bounty hunters, plus additional payments based on the number and value of captured fugitives. The flaw in Margaret's plan was her inexperience with managing multiple groups of slave catchers simultaneously. Caldwell's organization was professional and disciplined, focused on maximizing captures while minimizing unnecessary violence that might complicate the sale of their human cargo. The other groups Margaret had contacted were less sophisticated operations, more interested in the brutality of the hunt than in the efficiency of the business, and more concerned with intimidating abolitionists than with clean, profitable captures. As the date of the Great Liberation approached, Margaret found herself managing an increasingly complex web of communications and coordination. She had to ensure that each group of bounty hunters received the intelligence they needed while preventing them from discovering the involvement of competing operations. She had to coordinate timing to prevent conflicts between different groups while ensuring that no fugitives escaped through gaps in coverage. Most challenging of all, she had to maintain her facade as a devoted abolitionist while orchestrating the largest betrayal in the history of the Underground Railroad. The psychological pressure of managing the ultimate betrayal began to affect even Margaret's usually unflappable composure. She found herself making small mistakes that she had never made before, forgetting details of cover stories, providing conflicting information to different contacts, and displaying moments of nervous tension that her parents attributed to the natural stress of participating in such a dangerous operation. For the first time since beginning her collaboration with Caldwell, Margaret began to question whether she was capable of executing a plan of such complexity and scope. But Margaret's doubts were overwhelmed by her greed and her anticipation of the wealth that successful completion of the ultimate betrayal would provide. She had already made plans for her life after the operation. She would claim to be traumatized by the mass capture of fugitives and would travel to Philadelphia to recover from the shock. Once there, she would use her accumulated wealth to establish herself in respectable society, perhaps as a widow whose late husband had left her comfortable but not ostentatiously wealthy. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Margaret's cruelty, the horror in Chester County intensifies beyond imagination. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when greed transforms a human being into something far worse than any monster from our nightmares. Margaret's final preparations for the ultimate betrayal included the creation of detailed maps and schedules for each group of bounty hunters, coded communications protocols to prevent interception by Underground Railroad security, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during the operation. She had transformed her bedroom into a command center for coordinating the largest slave-catching operation in Pennsylvania history, complete with charts, timelines, and financial projections that would have impressed professional military strategists. But as Margaret put the finishing touches on her plans for the ultimate betrayal, she failed to notice that her months of suspicious behavior had finally attracted the attention of someone whose investigative skills far exceeded those of the discredited Thomas Garrett. Her own mother, Rebecca Thorne, had begun to question the subtle changes in her daughter's behavior, and the questions Rebecca was asking would soon lead to discoveries that would shake the Underground Railroad network to its very foundations. October 15th, 1847, dawned clear and cold, with the first frost of autumn coating the fields and forests of Chester County in a crystalline sheen that seemed to reflect the deathly chill that had settled over Margaret Thorne's soul. As 43 fugitives made their way through the darkness toward 3 assembly points throughout the county, Margaret sat in her bedroom making final adjustments to the most complex and evil plan ever conceived by an American teenager. The Great Liberation had been months in the planning, representing the culmination of years of underground railroad network development and the desperate hopes of dozens of enslaved families who had risked everything for a chance at freedom. The fugitives had traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory, surviving on courage and the faith that the network of abolitionists waiting for them could be trusted with their lives and their children's futures. Margaret had positioned 7 groups of bounty hunters at carefully calculated points along the escape routes, each group provided with detailed intelligence about specific aspects of the operation, but none aware of the others' involvement. Caldwell's professional team was stationed near Brandywine Creek, where the largest group of fugitives was expected to cross. 3 other groups were positioned along forest paths that connected various safe houses. 2 additional teams waited near road junctions where wagons would be most vulnerable to ambush. The 7th group was held in reserve, ready to pursue any fugitives who might escape the initial captures. But Margaret's elaborate plan began to unravel almost immediately. The multiple groups of bounty hunters, unaware of each other's presence and motivated by competition for the substantial rewards offered for captured fugitives, began treating the operation not as a coordinated effort, but as a contest to see who could capture the most valuable prizes. Instead of waiting for Margaret's carefully timed signals, several groups launched premature attacks that alerted other fugitives to the danger and created chaos throughout the operation. The first disaster occurred when 2 different groups of bounty hunters encountered the same family of fugitives near Pocopson Creek. The family, a skilled blacksmith named Daniel, his pregnant wife Sarah, and their 3 young children, had been traveling under the protection of a conductor named Isaiah Pennypacker when they stumbled into an ambush. But instead of a clean capture, the situation devolved into a violent confrontation between the 2 groups of slave catchers who both claimed the right to the substantial rewards the family represented. The gunfight that erupted between the competing bounty hunters was heard for miles across the quiet countryside. Isaiah Pennypacker was killed instantly when he tried to shield the children from the crossfire. Sarah went into premature labor from the shock and trauma of the attack, screaming in agony as her terrified children watched their father being beaten unconscious with rifle butts. The sound of her cries, mixed with the shouts of the bounty hunters and the sobbing of the children, created a hellish symphony that seemed to rise from the very depths of human evil. Margaret heard the distant gunshots from her bedroom window and realized immediately that her carefully coordinated plan was collapsing into chaos. But instead of feeling dismay at the failure of her operation, she felt only rage at the incompetence of the men she had hired to execute her vision. As reports began filtering back from the various ambush sites, Margaret learned that similar conflicts were erupting throughout Chester County as competing groups of bounty hunters fought over their human prey. The worst incident occurred at the Thorne family farm itself, where Samuel Thorne had been preparing to shelter the largest group of fugitives before guiding them north toward Philadelphia. 15 men, women, and children had gathered in the barn, sharing what they believed would be their last meal in captivity before beginning their journey to freedom. Samuel was reading from the Bible, offering words of hope and comfort to people who had already endured more suffering than most humans could bear. When Caldwell's men surrounded the barn, Samuel initially assumed they were additional conductors arriving to help with the evacuation. He opened the barn door with a welcoming smile, calling out greetings to what he thought were fellow abolitionists. The reality became clear only when he found himself staring down the barrels of multiple rifles held by men whose faces showed nothing but cold calculation and greed. "Step aside, old man," Caldwell commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "We're here for the cargo." Samuel Thorne, realizing the magnitude of the betrayal that had occurred, refused to move aside. "These are human beings under my protection," he declared, his Quaker principles forbidding him from violence, but not from courage. "I will not allow you to harm them." The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. Samuel was struck down by a rifle butt when he tried to block the entrance to the barn, his skull cracking with a sound that Margaret heard clearly from her bedroom window. As her father's blood seeped into the frozen ground, Margaret felt not grief, but annoyance that his interference was complicating her carefully planned operation. The capture of the 15 fugitives in the Thorne barn was accomplished with methodical efficiency, but the violence of Samuel's murder had traumatized the victims and alerted the entire neighborhood to what was happening. Church bells began ringing throughout Chester County as word spread that a massive slave-catching operation was underway, and armed abolitionists started converging on the various ambush sites. Margaret watched from her window as her father's body was dragged aside and the terrified fugitives were loaded into wagons like sacks of grain. She counted the captured men, women, and children with the same attention to detail she applied to her financial records, calculating the fees she would receive for each successful betrayal. Even the sight of Samuel's corpse couldn't distract her from the business aspects of the operation she had orchestrated. But Margaret's cold calculations were interrupted by the appearance of her mother, Rebecca, who had been awakened by the sounds of violence and had witnessed the final moments of her husband's murder. Rebecca's face showed not just grief and shock, but a terrible understanding that was far more dangerous to Margaret than any external investigation. "You knew," Rebecca whispered, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone whose worst suspicions have been confirmed. "You knew they were coming." Margaret had prepared for this moment, crafting explanations and alibis that would deflect suspicion and maintain her cover. But looking into her mother's eyes, she realized that deception was no longer possible. Rebecca had seen too much, understood too much, and suspected too much for any lie to be effective. "I did what was necessary," Margaret replied, her voice carrying none of the grief or shock that would have been appropriate for someone witnessing her father's murder. "Someone had to think practically about our situation." The confession that followed was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone Margaret used for discussing household chores. She explained her financial arrangements with Caldwell, her methods for gathering intelligence about Underground Railroad operations, and her calculations regarding the market value of different types of fugitives. She described her betrayals as business transactions, her victims as inventory, and her father's death as an unfortunate but predictable consequence of his naive idealism. Rebecca Thorne listened to her daughter's confession with growing horror, not just at the crimes that had been committed, but at the complete absence of remorse or humanity in Margaret's recounting of them. The girl standing before her was physically identical to the daughter she had raised, but psychologically she had become something monstrous. A predator who had fed on the trust and desperation of the most vulnerable people in America. "How many?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of continuing violence throughout the county. Margaret consulted her mental records with the precision of a professional accountant. 47 confirmed captures, she replied, though the final count from tonight's operations may bring the total to over 60. The number seemed to hang in the air between them like a physical weight, representing not just the scale of Margaret's betrayals, but the magnitude of human suffering she had caused. Each capture represented a family torn apart, dreams destroyed, and lives condemned to renewed slavery. The cumulative impact of Margaret's crimes was almost incomprehensible in its scope and cruelty. Rebecca's response was swift and final. She informed Margaret that she would be immediately expelled from the family home, and that her crimes would be reported to every Underground Railroad conductor and station master in the region. Margaret would be branded as a traitor and informant, making it impossible for her to continue her betrayals and ensuring that she would be shunned by every abolitionist community in America. But Margaret had already prepared for this contingency. Her accumulated wealth from months of betrayals was hidden in various locations throughout Chester County, and she had established contacts in California who could help her disappear into the anonymity of the gold rush migration. Her exile from Pennsylvania would be inconvenient but not financially devastating. The immediate aftermath of the Great Liberation Massacre, as historians would later call it, was chaos throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. Of the 43 fugitives who had attempted to escape that night, 38 were captured and returned to slavery. 5 had died during the various confrontations, including 2 children who were trampled during the panic at Brandywine Creek. The financial value of the captured fugitives exceeded $12,000, making it the most profitable single operation in the history of American slave catching. Margaret collected her fees from the various bounty hunter groups with the same business-like efficiency she had applied to organizing their operations. Her total earnings from the Great Liberation amounted to over $1,800, more than enough to establish herself comfortably in any city in America. She showed no emotion when collecting payment for the capture of families she had personally guided to safety, treating the transactions as routine business matters that required only accurate accounting and prompt payment. The investigation into the security breach that had made the Great Liberation possible was swift and thorough, but it came too late to prevent Margaret's escape. By the time Underground Railroad leaders had pieced together the evidence pointing to her as the source of the intelligence leaks, she had already departed Pennsylvania with a wagon full of belongings and a fabricated story about seeking relatives in California. Margaret's journey west took her through Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri, following the same routes used by thousands of other Americans seeking new opportunities in the expanding frontier. Her respectable appearance and carefully crafted personal history, she claimed to be a widow whose husband had died in a farming accident, allowed her to travel without suspicion or difficulty. Fellow travelers saw only a young woman of obvious good breeding who was courageously starting a new life after personal tragedy. She arrived in San Francisco in the spring of 1848, just as the gold rush was transforming California from a sleepy Mexican territory into a booming American state. The city's explosive growth and constantly changing population provided perfect cover for someone seeking to establish a new identity, and Margaret used her accumulated wealth to purchase a boarding house in a respectable neighborhood near Portsmouth Square. Margaret's boarding house catered to successful miners, merchants, and professional men who could afford clean rooms, decent food, and the company of a refined hostess who understood the social graces expected in civilized society. She presented herself as Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, a widow from Pennsylvania whose late husband had left her with modest but sufficient means to establish herself in business. Her guests found her to be charming, intelligent, and sympathetic to their stories of hardship and adventure in the goldfields. But Margaret's comfortable new life in California was built on the same foundation of deception and exploitation that had characterized her activities in Pennsylvania. She used her boarding house as a base for gathering intelligence about her guests' business activities, personal relationships, and financial resources. When opportunities arose, she didn't hesitate to exploit the information for profit, arranging to have wealthy guests robbed, manipulating business deals to her advantage, and even providing intelligence to claim jumpers and other criminals who preyed on successful miners. Margaret's California operations were more subtle than her Pennsylvania betrayals, but they were motivated by the same cold calculation and complete absence of empathy. She saw her guests not as human beings deserving of hospitality and protection, but as sources of information and opportunities for profit. Her boarding house became a carefully managed operation designed to extract maximum value from every person who trusted her with their safety and confidence. The pattern of Margaret's life in California, appearing respectable while secretly preying on those who trusted her, continued for several years. She expanded her boarding house into a small hotel, invested in real estate as San Francisco grew, and established herself as a prominent member of the city's business community. To outside observers, she appeared to be a successful entrepreneur who had overcome personal tragedy to build a prosperous new life. But Margaret's past eventually began to catch up with her. In 1852, Thomas Garrett arrived in San Francisco as part of a speaking tour about the Underground Railroad and the ongoing fight against slavery. Despite the damage that Margaret's campaign had done to his reputation, Garrett had continued his work as a conductor and had become even more methodical in his approach to detecting security threats and protecting fugitive slaves. When Garrett recognized Margaret at a social gathering, he immediately began investigating her background and activities in California. His inquiries revealed discrepancies in her personal history, unexplained wealth that exceeded what a widow's inheritance should have provided, and a pattern of suspicious incidents involving her hotel guests. Most importantly, Garrett discovered that several people who had trusted Margaret with sensitive information had subsequently suffered financial losses or other misfortunes that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Garrett's investigation culminated in a public confrontation during a church service attended by many of San Francisco's most prominent citizens. Standing before the congregation, Garrett revealed Margaret's true identity and detailed her crimes against the Underground Railroad and the fugitive slaves who had trusted her with their lives. His accusations were supported by documentation he had brought from Pennsylvania, including testimony from surviving witnesses and financial records that connected Margaret to known slave catchers. The impact of Garrett's revelation was immediate and devastating. Margaret found herself shunned by the same social circles that had welcomed her as a respectable widow. Her hotel guests departed en masse. Her business relationships were terminated, and her reputation in San Francisco's business community was utterly destroyed. Within weeks, she was forced to sell her properties at substantial losses and once again assume a new identity in order to survive. Margaret's final years were spent in obscurity and poverty, moving frequently between small towns throughout California and Oregon as her reputation inevitably caught up with her. She died in 1858 in a Sacramento boarding house, alone and forgotten except by the few people who remembered her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances over character. Her death certificate listed her age as 32 and her occupation as seamstress, but it made no mention of the dozens of lives she had destroyed or the immeasurable suffering she had caused. The true scope of Margaret Thorne's crimes may never be fully documented, but conservative estimates suggest that she was directly responsible for the capture and re-enslavement of at least 67 fugitive slaves during her brief but devastating career as an informant. Her betrayals disrupted Underground Railroad operations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, led to the deaths of numerous abolitionists who were caught in the violent raids she orchestrated, and created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that took years to overcome. More disturbing than the numbers, however, is what Margaret's story reveals about the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly innocent and respectable people. She possessed no obvious markers of criminality or moral corruption. She was educated, well-dressed, articulate, and raised in a family known for its commitment to humanitarian causes. Yet beneath her conventional exterior lay a complete absence of empathy and a willingness to treat human beings as commodities to be bought and sold for personal profit. Margaret's crimes were particularly heinous because they exploited the trust that was essential to Underground Railroad operations. Fugitive slaves had no choice but to rely on strangers who claimed to support their cause, often placing their lives and their children's futures in the hands of people they had never met before. Margaret weaponized this necessary trust, using it to identify and betray the very people who had risked everything to escape bondage. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Margaret's life and crimes suggests a form of moral pathology that was both rare and extremely dangerous. She appears to have been capable of understanding right and wrong in abstract terms, while being completely unable to apply those concepts to her own behavior. She could participate in religious services, express sympathy for others' suffering, and maintain the appearance of moral conviction while simultaneously orchestrating acts of unprecedented cruelty and betrayal. Margaret's story serves as a reminder that evil often wears a familiar face and speaks with a trusted voice. The greatest monsters in human history have rarely announced themselves as such. Instead, they have appeared as ordinary people who used their respectability as a weapon against those who had no choice but to trust them. Margaret Thorne represents the worst of American history, not because she was obviously evil, but because she was so successfully ordinary in her appearance, while being extraordinary in her capacity for cruelty. This mystery shows us that the capacity for evil exists in every generation and every community, often hidden beneath surfaces so normal that it remains invisible until the damage has been done. Margaret Thorne's crimes remind us that vigilance is the price of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their desperation for profit, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that people like Margaret Thorne are born evil, or are they created by circumstances and choices? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about whether places can retain the memory of the evil that occurred within them. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's forgotten past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as dark as this one. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying chapter from our nation's hidden history.